Greetings. This lecture is our first in a series of looking at the African American religious experience. My name is Dr. Gregory Jones, and I'll be bringing this lecture series to you, dealing specifically with the Black church experience in Black theology. If you remember, we had an overview lecture dealing with race, violence, and Western culture. This particular lecture series qualifies a lecture session for Theology 333, which is Black Theology, Black Church. And so this is part of our online lecture series that I'll be doing for that course. We must begin our lesson today with Kemet. You probably haven't heard of Kemet. Africans in America did not begin their origins in America. I often talk to my Jewish friends and some of my European colleagues and try to stress to them that blacks didn't begin their sojourn here in America in 1619. That was a part of a larger process that was taking place in the experience, the African American religious experience, that stretches far beyond 1619 or before 1619. But most of the historical and cultural analysis of African Americans has a tendency to start their time with us being enslaved and coming to America. That is not the case. We must start with Africa. Africa is the homeland of Africans in America. We are descended from Africans. We ought to be proud of that. And we need to understand and identify with the continent of Africa so that we might be able to give people a better and clearer understanding of who we are as a people. You need to talk about and begin to explore Nile Valley civilizations. And when we talk about Nile Valley civilizations, I specifically want you to focus in on what is called Egypt in European vernacular and Ethiopia. However, there's an older name for Egypt called Kemet. Kemet and the teachings of Ma'at are part of the Nile Valley civilization development. And I want to share a little information about that so that you can have an understanding of that. Later on, we'll see if we can take a look at some of the real topography of Africa. And I will also have provided for you in this course series a PowerPoint that will give you a sense of the scope and breadth of the civilizations that we're talking about. When we talk about African civilizations, we want to begin with Kemet, or as Europeans have labeled it, Egypt. Kemet and the teachings of Ma'at. Ma'at is an African deity, female deity that deals with reciprocity and justice and right relationship. In fact, I want to share some documentation with you in regards to Ma'at, because it's important that you understand how African peoples began their sojourn into this transition and terrible transformation into the Africans in America and this whole notion of slavery. It's impactful of our understanding and our religiosity, and it's important that we look at and understand clearly the teachings, the Kemetic teachings, and the teachings of ancient Kemet, and how they impact the development of how Africans in America begin to have religious experience. The teachings of Ma'at are the word interprets as truth, both the concept and the name of Netjer associated with truth, justice, order, and that which is right. Kemetic society hinged completely upon the furtherance of Ma'at, who was considered to be the first emanation of Timra, and depicted as a woman with wings, or ultimately a woman with her symbol, a single white ostrich feather, bound to her head. Maat in antiquity was the patroness of judges, magistrates, and all court officials. The phrase priests of Maat in inscriptions can be understood as a euphemism for judge. Maat's feather symbol is weighed against the heart of the deceased in the Hall of Judgment after death, a place which is known as the Hall of Matai, or double truth. Double in Kemetic implying something more serious or intense than a single something, much as we use the terms extra or advanced in the English language. Now, I share that with you because the teachings of Maat are kind of what is the glue that holds together the Nile Valley civilizations. And I want you to think a little about what I'm saying here. The Nile overflowed several times during the year. The Nile Valley civilizations, and I know this is going to be hard for some, but you need to be able to brace this. The origins of all civilization come out of Africa. Africa has some of the oldest and some of the most sophisticated civilizations and kingdoms that the world has ever known. Now, I know we have a love affair with India. I know that we have a love affair with Asia. And I know we have a love affair with Hispanic and Latin community. I am here to tell you that despite all the significant contributions that those sophisticated civilizations have provided to the world, some of the oldest influences and some of the oldest intellectual communities arrive out of the Nile Valley civilizations, out of Africa. And we have to be able to embrace that to understand the journey of Africans as they move from Africa into this world of Western European knowledge and understanding. Much of our identity has been lost in our assimilation into European culture, and we think that European culture is universal when it's not. It's very particular. I refer you to the overview lecture when I explain to you that much of the problematics and the pathos of the African American community, as well as the community at large and the global community, has been produced by a very narrow and very recent strain of Western European ideological thought. So we have to look at this very carefully if we were to understand with any kind of depth the contribution and the journey of Africans in America today. Now let's continue our study one with another as we look at some of the features of this whole notion of Kemet. Now Kemet is basically Egypt as we understand it in terms of the Western vernacular, but you have to understand that the people themselves named themselves Kemet, and Kemetic thinking has a particular outlook and a particular philosophy that we need to take a look at very closely. First of all, the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, in the Kemetic hieroglyph is KMT, and it means, it's defined as land of the blacks. That's what the KMT means. The KMT, in the furtherance of the language, comes out to the notion of Kemet, the people of Kemet. So that's what I want you to really understand, that the original people did not see themselves as Africans. The original people saw themselves as people of Kemet, and the philosophy, the primary philosophy that they understood themselves to govern themselves under was the philosophy of Maat, and the symbol of Maat and the deity of Maat gave us order, reciprocity, balance, harmony, and justice with all life, not just with ourselves as human beings, but we sought to be in balance with the environment, with other creatures that the deity had made and enforced, Creator had enforced, and so we were seeking to be in harmony with all of creation. Somehow we have, and we will be talking about the process by which we have divested ourselves of that important philosophical and religious feature. We will go into depth in terms of the religiosity of the teachings of Kemet in another lecture, but I want you to get this basis, the basis of this understanding at this time. I want you to also understand that Africans have a Kemetic outlook, and Western Europeans have a very different outlook, and there are two different ways that I want you to understand this outlook. Africans, we call it Kemetic thinking. Kemetic thinking has to do with relationship. It has to do with the seat of my creative self and my religious self is in relationship. I am because we are is a Kemetic thought. I am because we are. In other words, there is no I unless I am in community. If I'm not in community, then I have no self. Now, that's a little different than when we hear Europeans in Enlightenment coming out of the teaching of Descartes and Cartesian kind of thinking, where Cartesian thinking says, I think, therefore I am. So the seat of all creation, the seat of all intellectual inquiry, the seat of all control has to do with the individual's mind. It has nothing to do with relationship. And so very specifically, Europeans can move very quickly to self, and they don't necessarily have to have an understanding or definition of community. That is the reason why we see so much brutal exploitation of peoples, places, and things by European community. Because if they didn't think about it, it doesn't exist. If they didn't define it and give a name to it, then it does not have meaning. That is a very old philosophical process that comes out of the Enlightenment, and it fits very well in our overview when we talked about order out of chaos, and we also talked about how Friedrich Nietzsche kind of enhanced that understanding. If you want an in-depth understanding of the European process of thinking, an excellent book is written by one of the honorable men and scholars in this community, He's passed on now. His name was Jacob Carruthers, and he wrote a wonderful work called Intellectual Warfare. In that work, Jacob explains and gives clarity. Brother Carruthers talks very clearly about this whole, and he parallels Friedrich Nietzsche's assumption. Now, Nietzsche is a European speaking about Europeans. Jacob Carruthers is an African brother, a Pan-African brother that's speaking as well about Europeans. But in this particular moment, they coincide. Both, and particularly Jacob says that what we are dealing with when we deal with Europeans is basically folks who have always been barbarians and who have their intellectual prowess is always leaning toward self-serving, exploitative, and destructive nature. And we need to be very, very, very cautious on how we embrace and adopt European principles in the way that we define ourselves and define our behaviors. I would argue that he is absolutely correct, that many of the behaviors that we see that are detrimental to our community come from that notion of barbarian, that, you know, the prowess, the survival of the fittest, this whole notion of we've got to exploit, rape, and disenfranchise others for our own interests and gain. And I think it comes out, and to use an archaeological and anthropological perspective and spin on this, I think the Nile Valley civilizations were civilizations that did not have to compete for sustenance and food. The Nile overflowed 4 times a year almost, and so people were able to plant and to grow, and so they could learn at their leisure. When we talk about Kemetic teachings, I want you to understand that Kemet says that you need to observe and that you need to not pull environment out of balance. When we talk about Cartesian teaching and thinking scientific method, then we get into the whole notion of dissecting the frog and vivisecting the cats and the dogs. And what we have to do is we have to overpower the environment. And it's in our destruction of the environment that we come to an understanding of what the environment is. Now, all you have to do is look at the world and the way that it is today in terms of just the loss of species of animals and plants and the destruction of the environment. And you can see the Cartesian method, the method in I think therefore I am. It is a very destructive, very virile or viral, and almost cancerous kind of, it's more virus in terms of its pursuit of knowledge. The Kemetic method is a method that's closer to Native American, where we observe and participate and are balanced in the natural order of creation, and we make our intellectual pursuit be parallel to the evolution of that balance, harmony, reciprocity, and justice among all creatures that have life force. I want you to understand clearly about the Kemetic and Cartesian thinking, because that's kind of the root of how we begin to evolve our religiosity as a people, our African people. And as we look at the kingdoms and we look at the civilizations that were early on in the development of Africa, when we look at the kingdom of Sangay and Mali and Benin and Timbuktu, and we look at the tremendous contributions that Ghana puts in play in terms of just the art and science and architectural, from the burgeoning Kemetic communities that are spreading out over the African continent, we recognize that clearly the process of Mayat, the process of Kemetic thinking, I am because we are, community is much more important than myself. There is an extraordinary effort that is put in to developing relationship. Let me give you some examples of the Kemetic thought versus the Cartesian thought, and we're going to end with this. When I go to a party, when I go to a gathering, the party begins when we arrive. A Cartesian idea of that would be, it starts at 8 and it ends at 10. Well, that's not the way that people come together. Consequently, time and space and relationship are things that are very fluid, that are very much a part of the notion of how we gather together, the spirit in which we do that. And to be very stringent about time and space, even to the point, think about this, and this is, I'll end with this example. When you go to schools and you see kids sitting in carousels by themselves studying, that depicts a very narrow, a very lonely, a very individualistic kind of understanding. We're going to continue the lectures in these sessions to begin to deal in depth with how the Kemetic thinking and Cartesian thinking has influenced some of the great movements of religion in Africa. I want you to pay attention to some of the books that we'll be using: Black Religion, Black Radicalism, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Stolen Legacy, Before the Mayflower, Afrocentric Christianity, God of the Oppressed are some historical classics that we will continue to look at in our journey toward understanding and developing an idea about African American religious experience.